Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where your streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's edition of our Sermon Follow video. We are 2 weeks into our summer series edition, Blessed Summer, and we're talking about Matthew 5:3. It's the first beatitude that we're getting into this summer, and we're very excited about it. Pastor Gordon shared with us this Sunday, and can you give us once again just kind of a flyover, quick view of that, and we're going to go through these questions and see where they're going to take us.
Yeah, so last Sunday was the intro, the very first Sunday of the summer, and the summer series was the intro, looking at chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, where Jesus very clearly puts the standard ever out of reach of righteousness, and it compares righteousness to that of the scribes and the Pharisees. So this week what we did is really just began the actual content, the meat of what the rest of the summer will be about, and that is the Beatitudes, as Kyle already mentioned. This one is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so just one verse. It's totally different than our Acts series where we took off massive chunks at a time. This we're going completely the opposite direction, and we're digging ever so deeply as opposed to more broad. We're digging ever so deeply into each one each week. And so our first one was this week, blessed are the poor in spirit. Your intro there will hopefully help you and be consistent, therefore, with the Sunday message itself, that this idea of poverty is typically a bad thing. We talk about poverty from a negative standpoint, and rightly so. Jesus himself addresses poverty oftentimes in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the New Testament writers as a whole speak to the issue of poverty, and it is usually done so with the idea that believers in God should act on behalf of those who are poverty-stricken. However, in this particular one, we are called to seek a sense of poverty. It's just a matter of poverty of what, and that's really the heart of what Sunday's about.
Yeah. And it's this idea of being poor in spirit and humility and recognizing kind of our place before the Lord. It's good stuff. So the first question, we jump right in. It says, in what ways are we tempted to behave like the Pharisees towards one another on the basis of spiritual rank? And it's that whole idea of, I'm better than you because of this, or I'm better than you because of that. And it comes right out of last week. It's a good starting point right out of some of the things we talked about last week.
Yeah, and it does. It's a continuation of some of that very same subject matter. You'll notice, Kyle and I were talking about this a few minutes ago, you'll really notice that Matthew is, I'm learning this even as I'm studying for these, and as I've been studying for these first 2 weeks, just how consistent Matthew is in his messaging. The Pharisees are oftentimes the adversaries, which is most definitely the case where Jesus was concerned. They were his primary adversaries. Well, certainly Satan was, but the earthly adversary were the Pharisees. And so it's amazingly consistent how Matthew is. So yes, it is a continuation of what we talked about last week, because we're talking about the same folks, and that's these people we know of as the Pharisees, who were always creating a ladder, creating a hierarchy of righteousness. And I love this. It's given to you in the parentheses in the question, Matthew chapter 23. I really encourage you to go and read that, maybe together as a group. I loved it as I read it, and it comes out a lot on Sunday morning in the message, is that he calls it, that Jesus identifies what they are doing as burdening the people, to literally burden them with a standard that they then are not willing to help with. That's what I really find so amazing is that even if you were going to burden them, would you not want to help them deal with that burden? And in both cases, not only do they burden them, which is troubling in and of itself, but then they let them live in that burden. They let them remain there and just feel the oppression of not being good enough. And, the question is, in what ways are we tempted to behave? Just really sad to think that we would add burden to one another to sort of measure into a hierarchy of righteousness. And we don't want that. We want to free people from feeling that burden, so.
Yeah, that's good. And as you talk about that, and even think about that yourself a bit, some of that, the idea behind that is an internal thing, so what you're expecting from other people, yet not doing yourself, you know,
Right.
and others may not see that. But that passage, and I think we'll come back to that down here a little bit later, definitely read that as a group.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of things in there that are going to give you insight towards all these questions as you kind of discuss the big picture around it. So,
Yeah,
so
totally.
definitely do that. Second question says, if poor in spirit means spiritually humble, how can we pursue it? Or can we pursue it? And if so, how? What does that really even look like? And it's a three-part question, but it all goes together, and it's pretty important.
Yeah, what does it look like to pursue spiritual humility? I mean, that sounds very, can you really pursue humility? I mean, either you have it or you don't, and that's a lot of times what we will say to one another or to ourselves maybe. I'm either humble or I'm not. I either have this characteristic, this character trait of humility, or I don't. And so how do I pursue it? And I think in the area of righteousness, we can develop a sense of, at least grow our humility. And I know that sounds almost just bizarre to say
Working
that.
on my humility today, are you?
Exactly. I mean, we laugh at when in the Old Testament when Moses said he was called himself in his own writing, the first 5 books of Moses, he calls himself the most humble man on the earth. You know, and we all get tickled at that because that's such a funny statement. But it probably is a little bit challenging for us to engage this idea of growing in humility. Like Kyle just said, I'm working on that right now. I'm working on being humble. But is there a way to really pursue it? I invite you guys to discuss it. I don't necessarily have the answer on it. You know, Jesus uses a lot of examples of very specifically setting yourself in a position of low status, of starting from a position of humility and allowing either to be exalted or not by the master, you know. And so what are some practical ways? I'd love for you guys to think about it. You can even email us what you guys gained in terms of conversation. What does it mean to pursue humility, to strive for it? What does it look like when you do that among one another? And so, you know, I really invite you to look at one of the things that I think this was the question where we were talking about it, in our vision statement that I shared a couple of weeks ago. What would spiritual humility really, really look like? And one thing I mentioned in our vision statement was that we want to be a people that deeply, deeply love one another, and that we operate from a position of openness, of humility, of brokenness, of authenticity, all of these characteristics. But one of them was quick to confess and quick to forgive. Quick forgiveness is a great picture of spiritual humility, because it says, I am an offender myself. And so when I have been offended, all I need to realize is that I am as bad or worse of an offender as you are. And so your offense to me needs quick forgiveness. You come and you confess and you say, man, I did this to you, brother, or I did this to you, sister. I am so sorry. And our response, if we are pursuing spiritual humility, would be one of, you are forgiven, quickly. And so maybe that's one.
No, that's great. The more I think about that, since you mentioned it a while back, I might go so far as to say it's definitely one of the best indications or indicators we have when we're looking at ourselves.
Yeah.
To determine, are we spiritually humble? And in that, are we quick to forgive and are we quick to confess? Because if we're not quick to forgive, we're saying, you owe me.
Right.
You owe me. And this thing that you've done wrong, you know, against me and me alone, I am better than that. I'm worthy of more than that, and you owe me.
Yep.
When that's just not true.
That's
you know,
right.
because like Gordon just said, we're sinners too, and we have been forgiven much. And the same thing with confessing, whether it's confessing to someone else we've wronged them, or confessing to the Lord what we've done. When we are slow to confess, it's almost like we're holding on to this idea that we're not as bad as we think, or we're trying to justify what we did, even though we know it was wrong because we've been convicted of it. We're trying to say, well, but I did it because of this. Trying to kind of build up in ourselves, well, I'm not as bad as I really know that I am.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a fear with that humility. There's a fear of vulnerability with other people because we think we have to have a persona or whatever. When it all comes down to the value we hold is determined by God and God alone. And if that isn't sufficient for us, then everything starts to unravel and you're missing the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's golden right there. So that might be a little help to what does it look like, but maybe you guys will also come up with some other examples. Certainly you would think that confession and forgiveness would be some of how you could go to really picture that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
It's a good starting point. All right, the third question says, is it okay to be motivated to pursue spiritual poverty by a promise of reward. So, or does that contradict itself just right there? You know,
Right.
is it okay to be motivated to get the reward that's promised to us, or is that all out of whack?
Yeah, and this like question number 1, a couple minutes ago that we just talked about, question 3, what Kyle just read there and we're inviting you to wrestle with, it is also a continuation of what was talked about a little bit last week, that all through this section of Matthew 5, all through the book of Matthew, all through the New Testament, is an invitation to pursue reward, and that God is a rewarder. And so the answer for me is it okay to be motivated to this? I would say if it's not okay, then like I mentioned last week, then we have to strike out a significant portion of the New Testament. God knows what brings us excitement and enthusiasm. He knows what does that, and absolutely a grateful heart he is looking for, a heart that is simply chasing after him. All I want is to have, you, God. All I want is you. But he adds with that, there is so much that I want to give you. There's so much, and in response to your humility in this case, or into your obedience, reward comes, and it's not contradictory. And unless he is contradicting himself, and I think we all would agree that that's not in fact what he is doing, that reward is his idea. He loves to lavish good things on his children, and that's what we are. And so when we come to him and we have operated according to what he would want us to do, then I think he rewards for that. This is not spiritual, this is not justification. This is not gaining us or losing us heaven, eternal life. This is about being a disciple, being a child that follows obediently the call of our Father. So definitely.
Yeah, and like you said, he wants to give us that reward. It gives him joy. I may have shared this once before on one of these videos, but I'm a gift giver. That's one of my main love languages, right? Gift giving, and I love to give my kids good things, and I look for opportunities to do it. And so when they do something well or they do something right, I get all excited. Okay, how can I reward them? How can I show them in this particular way my approval and my how I love them, and just to kind of lavish that on them, because I know it brings them joy. It brings me joy to do that, and it's the same with God. And you don't want, so like I'll take my kids out on a man night or a date night, depending on which kid it is, and oftentimes we end up going to the toy store and I'll get them something little or whatever, But one time I was out with one of them. They will go nameless because they may watch this when they're in their teens, and I don't want to pay for therapy. So we go there and they're like, we're out eating, and all they're talking about is the toy that we might get later. And it started to kind of dawn on me, like, well, they're not here to hang out with me. They just want the reward, or they want the toy, they want whatever it is. And that joy is then stolen, right? And it's that same thing when the focus is on that. But at the same time, if I know that they are going to receive that reward or that gift as me showing them that I love them, then I want to give them all the more.
Yeah, that's a good.
And so that's how it is with God. As long as we don't put the award the reward as the pinnacle, but it's what that reward represents.
Mm-hmm.
That represents a love of a father. That in the big scheme of things is obviously it.
Yeah.
And I think it's good. I think it's
That's
great.
a good analogy. Good.
So the fourth question is discuss Jesus' invitation to rest in Matthew 11 from the perspective of the burden of righteousness. And this is that verse, take my yoke upon me, or my yoke upon you, and my burden is light. That
Right.
idea. So yeah, what does that mean to rest? That invitation that he gives us in the perspective of the burden of righteousness.
I think, Matthew 11, 28 to 30, where just what Kyle was referring to, and it's at the bottom. It's your meditative verse, your meditation verse for the week, if you choose to do that. Those are 3 of our favorite verses that Jesus ever speaks, and they are. This is going to be somewhat of a repeat of what I talked about on Sunday, but they're some of our favorite verses. We sort of have captured these to memory. And yet they, in some ways, are our most misunderstood. We all oftentimes ask ourselves, what does Jesus mean when he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light, and you shall find rest for your souls. I love that phrase that is in there. You shall find rest for your souls. It's one of our favorites because it sounds so good, and yet it's probably one that we struggle with the most. Like, what does that really mean? Another one is, Beverly and I talk about it a lot. Another one is John chapter 4, when Jesus says to the woman at the well, what does it mean that if you will take what I have given you, you will never thirst again, but rather it will be like, springs that will well up within you. That's another example of one that we love, and yet we sit back and we go, what does that really mean? Because I'm not sure I feel it. I'm not sure, I don't feel rested. And so in this particular case, and we talk a lot about it on Sunday morning, and this is just a further explanation, I hope, but that it really does, one of the significant things, the ingredients of what he's talking about, is the subject of righteousness. I don't think there's any question about it. You take Matthew in its entirety, you take what we've been talking about, it's just a continuation of that idea that I feel burdened. Well, what do you feel burdened about? What is it did God place that burden on you? That is not his burden. Jesus says that himself. This is not my burden. My burden is light, and you will find rest for your souls. So I need to spend some time thinking, because if his burden is light and it ultimately brings rest, and I don't feel that, what is it talking about? And I think very much so the subject is heavily the subject of righteousness.
Yeah.
You take that exact same parallel, and we go back to Matthew 23, what we talked about a few minutes ago, that the Pharisees were actually burdening them with this idea of righteousness. And Jesus says, I'm not here to burden you with it. I'm here to give you mine. And again, that's kind of continuing the subject matter. So
Yeah, that's so good. It's just that idea of, I'm striving and toiling to earn something that I can't seem to make any headway at. And Jesus says, I already got it. I already got it for you.
Right.
You're fighting a battle that's unwinnable and unnecessary.
right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's
So good deal.
Yeah, and the last question it says here is God's exaltation of the humble adequate for you? Why is man's exaltation more valuable to us? Exaltation is a very big churchy word, so clearly Pastor Gordon wrote these questions. But yes, that idea is God's
You
exaltation.
should have seen Kyle's word for this. I couldn't. It was in crayon, first of all, and then I couldn't even make it out. I don't even know
I
if
was
it was a
using
word.
numbers instead of letters. It was not pretty
Wingdings
sight.
and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. So exaltation.
Yeah,
We'll go with that.
So is God's exaltation of the humble adequate for us?
I think this is sort of an easy and yet ocean deep, all at the same time. The easy, we have people right in front of us. We have people, and we cannot help but strive for that sense of approval. We talked about it last week. We just keep going back to the same well. No matter how dry it is, we keep going back to that same well of approval from men. Why? Because they're in front of us, because I can touch, I can feel, I can either see a smile of approval or I can see a frown of disapproval, and it's so immediate, and it's in real time. And there is absolutely an element of which God calls us to be delayed in our gratification, to wait on him, to wait and to say, I promise you this. I promise that this is true, that I will exalt the humble. The humble, those who seek high place, they will be humbled, but those who are humble, they will be exalted. And so it really is, it's a question of our faith. Do we really believe that God is going to come through in the end, and that it's worth the wait? There's the illustration told of the sons that are lost at sea, out in the water, and the father says, don't drink of the water. I promise you, don't drink of the water, for if you drink of it, you'll be worse off than when you started. And that's kind of a picture of this. We take the salty, unnourishing water of the ocean, because it's all around us, and we can't think that there's ever going to be. It looks like water. It looks exactly like water. It looks like approval, and that's good enough for me. And we have no idea of the feast that God has prepared for us, the fresh water that he has for us to drink. And so, it's in some ways it's an easy answer, and yet it digs to the very bottom of the ocean of depth of understanding.
Yeah, no, it does. You can go a long ways with that question. And it does come down to, do I trust that God's way is right, that God's reward is good, that what he has waiting for me. And that's a perfect example that you're going to drink that which you think is going to be like life-giving is going to rot you.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, it really is. That's good. So
Good deal.
all right. Very good. Don't blow it again this week.
Blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering.